see it? Great, thanks. Okay, so it's a pleasure to open this workshop. I've been looking forward to it. Time's a bit short, so I'm going to jump right in here. So because we know that not everyone is completely familiar with this approach at the moment, so I'm going to start with a bit of general recap about the capabilities approach and how we might apply it. So just to explain a bit about the capabilities approach more generally first. So at the heart of this approach are these two concepts of functionings and capabilities. So functionings are often talked about as valued beings and doings. So there might be states like being in good health, or they might be things that we want to do, like having relationships. And a capability is the opportunity to engage in any given functioning. So this distinction is quite important between the two because it's a liberal approach. Then we want to focus on the capabilities, what people have the opportunities to do, rather than the functionings, which are the things that they actually do. So it's really about what people are able to do if they want to. So we want people to have multiple opportunities, but we don't necessarily prescribe that they have to take them up. So capabilities are therefore a form of freedom, to put it in sense terms, if that makes sense. So why might we want to focus on capabilities? The idea of the approach is that we should use capabilities as the metric with which we think about poverty and justice. And what this means is that we're focusing on outcomes, what people are able to do, rather than the inputs or the resources that they have. So this shift is important because it recognises that different people might need different levels of resources in order to get to the same outcome. Or if you want to put it another way, then if you give people the same resources, this might not actually result in equal outcomes. And the reasons for this are to do with things like personal attributes, like maybe gender or disability, and the context and circumstances in which people live, like their physical or social environments. And another important feature of the approach is that it's very multidimensional. So it focuses on a whole range of capabilities that we might need in order to flourish. So if we think about how we can apply this to energy, energy poverty, and energy justice, what are the implications of that? Well, first of all, it means that we're focusing on what we need energy for. So we're focusing on the outcomes rather than focusing on energy itself or even energy services. And because it's multidimensional, it recognises that energy is connected to all kinds of important outcomes. So it takes the emphasis perhaps more broadly than traditional energy poverty research, which might focus more on heating or other kinds of specific services. And for the reasons that I explained in the previous slide, it's got this inbuilt recognition that different people might have different needs. So they might need different amounts of energy or different energy services, perhaps different services or different amounts of them in order to achieve the desired outcomes. So again, depending on individual characteristics, circumstances, and so on. And then another important feature of the approach is that it recommends looking at capabilities of the individual. So this again is a bit different perhaps from traditional or more conventional energy poverty research. So it means that we can ask questions like, are capabilities and energy different for men and women, for example? So it's focused on the individual methodologically, but I think it's important to say that that's not the same thing as saying that individuals are responsible for their own capabilities. That's, I think, sometimes a misunderstanding about the approach. So just maybe to help think about this relationship between energy and outcomes, here's a diagram from an earlier publication by me and colleagues, including Neil, who's speaking next. The full reference is there. It's an open access paper, so to look at this in more detail, you can look at the reference. But if we go from left to right on this diagram, we start off with the energy source, energy carrier, which is converted to usable energy, which, as we know, what we really want is the energy services. But then we can take that thinking a step further and think that actually what we really want energy services for is in order to be able to do certain things, like we want to be able to wash clothes, cook food, send messages to friends, and so on. And we can take that another step further and think, well, the reason why we want to do those things is because we want to achieve various important states, like being in good health or having good relationships, and so on. So that's a basic schematic. It's important to separate these elements because where these arrows are, all of these relationships are actually dynamic. So and they can sort of quantitatively vary in these gaps. I haven't got time to talk about that more, but you can read the paper for that. Also, it is a simplified diagram, so we could actually complicate it by adding more things. So for example, capabilities might affect our access to resources. Lucy Middlemiss and colleagues made that point well in their work. Also, the basic capabilities and secondary ones are connected with each other in maybe quite complicated ways. So it is a simplified schematic, but hopefully useful for thinking about this overall relationship. So thinking in this way led us to define energy poverty like this in our paper. So energy poverty is an inability to realise essential capabilities as a direct or indirect result of insufficient access to affordable, reliable and safe energy services, taking into account reasonable alternative means of realising the capabilities. So this definition has built into it, it still acknowledges the issues about affordability, about the quality of the energy services, and safe means not, for example, polluting too much, for example. And the second point, the last part of that definition, I'm going to come back to hopefully at the end. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk is to focus on a couple of challenges in implementing this approach. So I hope I've convinced you that there's merits to the approach, but it is clearly quite challenging in some ways. There's more than 2 challenges, but I've just got time for 2, I think, I hope. So the first one relates to how we define these essential capabilities that we want to focus on. So clearly capabilities can be lots of different things. Some of them are really important things and profound things like having relationships or voting. Some capabilities might be a bit more trivial, like keeping tropical fish. Some of them might even be damaging. So I think it's fair to say that when we're thinking about poverty and energy poverty, we're not equally interested in all of them. We're going to be more interested in some than others, so we want to prioritise them. But the question is, how do we decide which of those are the important ones to focus on? So within the overall approach, there's basically 2 main schools of thought here, following either Nussbaum or Sen. One of them is to use a predefined theoretical list, and the other one is to have a deliberative process as part of the project or intervention. So just to touch briefly on the advantages and disadvantages of these. So Martha Nussbaum famously came up with a list of central capabilities. So these are theoretically defined from a whole range of philosophical starting points. She saw these as the fundamental elements of a flourishing life, and she felt that these were things that could broadly reach, people would broadly agree on, regardless of their cultural and religious background. So she talked about overlapping consensus. She also thought about these as potentially akin to rights, so the state might have a responsibility for guaranteeing these capabilities for all their citizens, for example. So there's advantages and disadvantages to using this approach, I think, as the starting point. So in terms of advantages, it's got a thorough philosophical basis. It's comprehensive, so it takes in lots of different dimensions of a flourishing life. And in practical terms, it's quite helpful for research sometimes to have this predefined list to work from. It's also maybe interesting for energy work that it has a connection already with notions of rights. But there's also disadvantages, so it's had quite a lot of critique, I think it's fair to say, for being maybe paternalistic, for being Western-centric. It's also been defended along those lines. You can read those arguments in the literature. It is quite an abstract list that would require specification anyway, in any given context, and for example, thresholds of these capabilities. And I think another thing that I've been pondering is that actually the point of Nussbaum's central capabilities is not that they're the end point of what we want to get to, but actually they're a starting point for a flourishing life. So even when you have the central capabilities in place, they would probably lead on to all kinds of other functionings and capabilities. But nevertheless, it has been used, so quite a lot of energy poverty research has used, from a capabilities perspective, has used Nussbaum's list as a start. So just to give you a really brief example, here's some work I was involved in, the references there, it's open access. And we used, this was in rural communities in Mexico, and we used Nussbaum's capabilities as a starting point for some discussion groups. We started with the basic ones here. This is health, I think. It's covered up by all your faces for me. And we worked back from that to discuss with communities what they would need to do in their own context in order to achieve health, and to then map the relationships with energy services. And these traffic light colours, red, orange, green, indicate whether the current state of those relationships was currently good or not so good, or actually really bad. So that's the diagram we made for health. That's an example of one for affiliation. moving on to sense deliberative approach and the pros and cons of this. So as I said, so sense approach is actually not to define an ideal list, but to define within the context of any project or intervention, which are the capabilities you want to focus on in that context. So it's a turn away from, it's not an idealistic approach, it's a more pragmatic approach that thinks about, well, what are we choosing between in this instance? So that has the advantages of not being paternalistic. It will produce a list that's very relevant to the specific context and probably less abstract than the SPANS list. But some disadvantages, I think, is that this will be more variable across time and space. So it's much harder to use as a metric that might be applied in a lot of different contexts. Deliberative processes, as we know, are quite time consuming. They can be quite difficult. There are, however, models, you know, they're not impossible. These things are done. And I think an important point, though, is that this would require consensus. So it kind of assumes that the deliberation will end up in a consensus about the important capabilities, but that has the potential, I think, to hide diversity and group differences in priorities. So that would be something else to ponder there. So hopefully I've got a couple of minutes to move on to the second challenge that I wanted to bring up. And this is about the relationship between energy services and capabilities. So this goes back to the second half of our definition. So we talked about how we need to take into account available reasonable alternatives for realising these capabilities. So if you think about it, most capabilities, or a lot of capabilities, they might be realised through energy services, but there are often alternatives as well. So if we think about keeping warm, we can keep warm through heating, energy service, or we can keep warm through clothing. So we probably wouldn't be very sympathetic to claims of energy poverty if someone felt that they were cold because their heating was expensive whilst they wanted to wear a t-shirt all the time at home, right? So we'd expect people to wear a sensible amount of clothing. But on the other hand, you wouldn't necessarily expect them to wear, well, we wouldn't expect them to wear winter clothes, outdoor clothes indoors, because that wouldn't be reasonable. So we need to balance the alternatives with the need to use energy services. But I think this is an important point, especially in the context of climate change and sustainability and limited resources, because what we're doing here is decoupling capabilities from energy services. And for me, this is always an important part of the approach because of the links with sustainability and so on. So if we go back to the diagram, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but it's really about these spaces between energy services and secondary capabilities and the space between secondary capabilities and basic ones. So these spaces here, by separating, that allows us to ask questions like, can we achieve capabilities by alternative means to household energy services? So for example, if we want to wash clothes, does everyone need a washing machine at home? Could we use communal washing machines? If we want to visit friends, can we do it on public transport rather than having a car, for example? Also, which secondary capabilities do we need and how much of them to underpin the essential basic ones? Like, so we need to wash ourselves in order to have social respect and be healthy, but do we need to have 3 showers a day? You know, or maybe we can wash our clothes once every 3 times wearing them instead of every time, for example. So these are questions that can be asked in those spaces. But this is a challenge for implementing the approach in terms of making metrics, right? So this relationship between energy services and capabilities isn't straightforward and it shouldn't be assumed. I think it's probably easier when there's a problem. So it's easier to identify when capabilities have been compromised by a lack of energy services, but it's a bigger challenge to define what energy services we think are reasonable to be there in order to provide capabilities, or where we might expect alternatives to be used instead. This, I think, is probably another matter for deliberation. I think also this might be more relevant to energy justice than energy poverty. So my point here is not to say that we should challenge claims of energy poverty by saying, well, people should just find an alternative means instead. You know, they should stop complaining about being cold and put on a winter coat. That's not the point here. But I think, first of all, I think these questions allow us to think more creatively about how to provide capabilities rather than always having energy as the go-to. But I think it also is helpful in thinking about higher levels of consumption. So actually, this is where energy justice is important. So actually, maybe to challenge some of the higher levels of consumption that we might need to bring down in order to allow greater levels of consumption at the lower end. And finally, I think there's implications here for rights to energy discourses, because the point is that the right is the right to the capability, not necessarily the right to the energy. So if there are alternatives for energy, it's a little bit troubling of the idea of a right to energy per se. So that was a quick gallop through some introductory things and a couple of challenges. I hope that that's started some thinking about why the capabilities approach might be a good approach to use to think about energy poverty, for the reasons here. There's clearly implementation challenges. I've mentioned a couple. I know that colleagues are going to talk about some others as well. And I think that deliberative models are quite a promising way forward. There are bases which can be built on that are already there in the literature, such as consensual approaches to poverty, but they do need trialing. So I'm looking forward to hopefully more work in this area. Thank you.